He'd survived wars, special forces training, decades in one of the world's most dangerous places. But Antarctica doesn't care about your resume. This is the story of Henry Worsley, a British Army lieutenant colonel, special forces officer, and polar obsessive, who tried to accomplish what no human ever had, crossing the entire Antarctic continent alone, on foot, with no outside help. He made it further than anyone thought possible, and then, just 30 miles from his goal, everything fell apart. Alistair Edward Henry Worsley was born in 1960. He joined the British Army straight from school in 1980 and spent the next 35 years in uniform. Royal Green Jackets, the Rifles, the SAS, Special Air Service, Northern Ireland, Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan. He'd seen it all. Peers described him as the epitome of what an SAS man should be. Adventurous, brave, determined. Bear Grylls, who knew him personally, called him one of the strongest and bravest soldiers he'd ever met. His wife Joanna said she never worried about him, not once, because Henry was invincible. But Henry had another obsession, beyond soldiering. Since childhood, he'd been fixated on the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, the early 1900s, when the continent was still unconquered, and men died trying to reach the South Pole. Three names dominated that era: Robert Falcon Scott, Roald Amundsen, and then there was Ernest Shackleton. Shackleton was different. He wasn't the first to the pole. He never completed his grand expeditions, but he became the most famous of them all, not for succeeding, but for surviving. In 1909, he led a team to within 97 miles of the South Pole, closer than anyone had ever gotten. Then, he made a decision that seemed insane at the time. He turned back. His men were starving. The conditions were impossible, so Shackleton chose life over glory. He later said he'd rather be a living donkey than a dead lion. His men made it home, and that decision became legendary, and Henry Worsley worshipped him. He idolized Shackleton, read every book, studied every map. Years earlier, on one of his Antarctic journeys, Henry even slept beside Shackleton's grave in South Georgia. But here's where it gets even deeper. Henry Worsley was a distant relative of Frank Worsley, the legendary captain and navigator of Shackleton's ship, the Endurance. Henry had exploration literally in his blood. So he didn't just read about these men, he recreated their journeys. In 2008, Worsley organized a three-man team to retrace Shackleton's 1909 route, the one where Shackleton turned back 97 miles short. His teammates were descendants of Shackleton's own crew. 3 generations later, they returned to finish what their ancestors couldn't. Henry and his team made it to the pole. 3 years later, in 2011, he did it again. This time, he led a team along Amundsen's route. When he finished, Henry Worsley became the only person in history to have completed both the Shackleton route and the Amundsen route to the South Pole. Most people would have stopped there. Henry didn't, because replicating history wasn't enough anymore. He wanted to beat it, and there was one challenge left, the biggest one. The crossing Shackleton had attempted in 1914, but never completed. This was Shackleton's ultimate goal. In 1914, he set sail on his ship, the Endurance, to cross the entire Antarctic continent. He never made it to land. The ship was trapped in pack ice and crushed, leaving his 28-man crew stranded for months. The mission became the most famous survival story of all time, involving a desperate 800-mile open boat journey to find help. A journey navigated by none other than Henry's own relative, Frank Worsley. Shackleton famously saved every single man. He became immortal for surviving, but the crossing itself was never finished. Henry decided to finish it, solo, unsupported, unassisted. Let's be clear what that means. No resupply drops, no kites or sails to help pull the sledge, no team, just one man alone, dragging over 330 pounds of gear across 1,000 miles of ice. It had never been done. Technically, a Norwegian explorer named Børge Ousland had crossed Antarctica solo in 1996, but he used a windsail. By modern adventure tracking standards, that's classified as supported. So Henry's mission was the first truly unsupported solo crossing. But this wasn't just about adventure. Henry wanted to raise 100,000 pounds for the Endeavour Fund, a charity supporting wounded British veterans. He'd just retired from the army after 35 years. He wanted to leave something behind, a financial legacy for his wounded mates, as he put it. But to raise that kind of money, he needed a story. And the story had to be historic, first ever, record-breaking. So the goal and the charity became inseparable. On November 13th, 2015, 1 month after retiring from the army, Henry Worsley began his journey from Berkner Island on the Weddell Sea coast. His first audio dispatches were full of energy, glorious sunshine, unbelievable science. He called Antarctica the best place on Earth right now. He sent daily updates. On Christmas Day, Prince William called him via satellite phone. By early January, around day 52, Henry reached the South Pole, the halfway point. He kept going, and for the next 2 weeks, he was fine. Exhausted, certainly. Losing weight, obviously. But Fine. Until he wasn't. By day 70, the gradual grinding down had taken its toll. He'd lost roughly 50 pounds. The surface had turned into soft snow, and then a storm pinned him down in his tent. Total whiteout. He described the view as nothing to see but white darkness. For 2 straight days, day 69 and day 70, he couldn't move, just lying there alone. What he didn't know was that his body was dying from the inside. The peritonitis meant his perforated bowel was leaking toxic waste into his abdomen. For 48 hours, he lay in that tent, mistaking a fatal medical emergency for simple exhaustion, but he couldn't call for help. He was carrying more than just his own burden. That flag in his sledge, for my wounded mates. He felt he was carrying their struggles. Quitting meant failing them. Henry was Special Forces tough, the kind of tough that's trained to ignore pain. That mindset had carried him 913 miles in 71 days, but it was also killing him. On day 71, January 22nd, 2016, he made the call. He contacted his support team and requested an evacuation. In his final audio dispatch, he was deliberate, reflective. He quoted his hero. When my hero, Ernest Shackleton, was 97 miles from the South Pole on the morning of January 9th, 1909, he said he'd shot his bolt. Well, today I have to inform you with some sadness that I too have shot my bolt. Shot his bolt. It's an old phrase meaning you fired your last arrow. Nothing left to give. He said his journey was at an end. He said he'd lick his wounds, that he'd come to terms with the disappointment. Then, he said he was going to fly 6 hours to Union Glacier, get a hot cup of tea, maybe a cake. He was 30 miles from his goal, on the Shackleton Glacier, stopped on the final hurdle, literally named for his hero. A twin otter arrived. When they landed, Worsley refused to be stretchered or helped. He was septic, dying, but he walked to the plane himself, climbed in, sat down, and calmly asked for a cup of tea and a slice of fruitcake. They flew him to Union Glacier. The next day, January 23rd, they evacuated him to Punta Arenas, Chile. That's when the doctors realized what was really wrong. It wasn't exhaustion. It was bacterial peritonitis. His body was shutting down. He was in septic shock. They rushed him into emergency surgery. And for a brief moment, it looked like maybe, just maybe, he'd pull through. He didn't. On January 24, 2016, Henry Worsley died in the intensive care unit from complete organ failure. He was 55 years old. He survived 71 days alone in Antarctica. He walked 913 miles. He called for rescue. He made it to a hospital, and then he died anyway. Because by the time he realized something was wrong, his body had already passed the point of no return. Henry knew the Shackleton story better than almost anyone alive. He knew that in 1909, Shackleton turned back 97 miles from the pole because he understood the difference between ambition and survival. Shackleton famously said he'd rather be a living donkey than a dead lion, and Henry agreed with that. His wife said he quoted it all the time. But when the moment came, he didn't follow it. He stayed in that tent for 2 days. 2 days of knowing something was catastrophically wrong, but convincing himself it was just exhaustion. He tried to tough it out, and it killed him. And then, something extraordinary happened. By the time he died, the Shackleton solo expedition had raised over 100,000 pounds. After his death, donations flooded in. The final total reached over 500,000 pounds. He failed the crossing, but he spectacularly succeeded in his primary mission, though he never lived to see it. In December 2017, his family made the journey to South Georgia and buried his ashes beside his hero, Ernest Shackleton, right where he wanted to be. A year later, in 2018, an American endurance athlete named Colin O'Brady completed the crossing Henry had died attempting. Henry Worsley wanted to be remembered forever, and in a tragic, backwards way, he succeeded. Because when people talk about that crossing, they don't just mention O'Brady's triumph. They talk about Worsley's sacrifice, not as the man who conquered Antarctica, but as the man who proved that even the strongest, bravest, most invincible soldier can still be just 30 miles short of everything.